Tyrone Tracy has entered the transfer portal. More on that in a second. Before we start, be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already subscribed to our channel. Lots of great content on the way, including our game-by-game, post-game shows with Coach Gary Close after every Iowa men's basketball game, right here on this channel, live streams after every Iowa basketball game. So again, hit the subscribe button and be sure to hit the like button as well. Always appreciated. Back to the news today. Tyrone Tracy, Iowa's junior wide receiver, has announced his intention of transferring. Or I should say he hasn't announced it formally, but he has shown up in the portal, according to multiple reports. Obviously, it's been a season of disappointment for Tyrone. You think about back to the Kent State game, sort of the epitome of what was to come for Tyrone, the infamous catch that was for naught, where it clearly looked like he had finished the catch and hit the ground and the ball came out, and of course the officials reviewed it and overturned it. It was a bad call, but that sort of was a microcosm of what was to come, or a foreshadowing of what was to come. We know, of course, a few weeks later, Keegan Johnson and Arlen Bruce really began to emerge, which obviously hurt Tyrone Tracy on the depth chart. Nico Reganey had a big catch against Penn State, which ended up being the game winner. And really, there were no moments like that for Tyrone this year. And of course, going into this year, everybody perceived Tyrone Tracy to be the best receiver on this roster. I mean, there were talks about him being one of the better receivers in the Big Ten Conference. Think about that for a second. And rightfully so. I mean, if you look at his stats, let's flash back to 2018. I mean, the kid was a freshman, only played in a couple of games. Well, I think he played in 4 games. Only had, I believe, 1 catch for 22 yards in 18. But in 19, he had 36 catches for 589 yards and an average of over 16 a catch, including 3 touchdowns. And since then, it's been a kind of a backwards motion for Tracy. Sophomore year, redshirt sophomore year, of course, the COVID year, he played in every game, 154 yards for Tyrone. The average goes down to 11 per catch. And then this year, of course, he's played in every game. Okay, he's shown up in the participation log on every game, but just 10 games where he's recorded statistics, 15 catches, 106 yards on the season. Think about that for a second. Now, I will say this, as an endorsement to Tyrone, we saw him play a lot in the Big Ten title game this past weekend, and the kid's still working. He's still out there blocking. He's still out there working for his teammates. You flash back to the Penn State game, that big play to Tyrone Tracy, and, of course, the Fox cameras, the first thing Fox panned over to was Tyrone congratulating Nico Reganey, and that's good to see. That shows that he's still a favorite in the locker room, and certainly his teammates, you'd have to think, would respect him. Heading into the year, he really was a leader, especially with some of the offseason issues around the coaching staff and the racial disparity claims that emerged last summer, or I should say 2 summers ago now. And Tyrone was at the front of that and really was a spokesman for this program and talking about how it felt more like a family. It felt like things were changing. And then, of course, we know his brother's tweet earlier this season complaining about Tyrone not being utilized to the fullest. And then, of course, just a few short weeks ago, a cryptic tweet from Tyrone Tracy himself about how Iowa was not using, quote, a Swiss Army knife, end quote, that was on their roster. I think it's frustration. Everybody's human, and especially when this is the first full season where Iowa players have had access to Twitter mid-season. And that's precisely why Kirk Ferentz didn't want his players on Twitter. I don't think it had anything to do with trying to quiet the voices of those who were being persecuted, racially. I mean, not to say that there wasn't any injustice going on there. I think that's been well documented. But I think the Twitter ban, there's we've seen Fran McCaffrey instill a Twitter ban. You remember years ago the Zach McCabe incident where he replied to an Iowa fan in kind. And so it makes sense, and certainly that kind of came back to bite Tyrone this year. And a few hours later he deleted that tweet. But it just showed some frustration, and again, it's understandable. I mean, it's understandable. And not to mention, you go home for the Big Ten championship game and get crushed. Your team gets crushed 42-3 in Indianapolis. It's just been a rough go of it for Tyrone. I feel sorry for the kid. He's obviously a hard worker. He's made some mistakes. The tweet was inappropriate. You just don't do that, obviously. But Kirk Ferentz, I give Kirk credit on that one. Kirk defended Tyrone. After that tweet came out, Kirk was asked about it during his weekly press conference, and he basically just said, "Hey, it's a kid who wants to help his team." And I admire Kirk for sticking up for Tyrone. I'm sure, Kirk or Kelton Copeland or Brian Ferentz had a conversation with Tyrone. He can't do that. But we've seen the writing on the wall of this coming for quite some time, I think. And again, we saw Tyrone excel 2 years ago. So there's no reason to think he can't go somewhere else and be a major factor. He is a little undersized, but we saw him really play well at that slot position a couple of years ago when you had Amir Smith-Marset, Brandon Smith alongside Tyrone Tracy. Think back to the USC Iowa game in 2019. Of course, that was a huge performance for Iowa in that game. And it wasn't just Tyrone Tracy. It was Amir Smith-Marset in that entire offense, 49 points against the Trojans. And let's remember, Tyrone Tracy was very involved in the offense in 19, and it showed up in that bowl game. And again, it's not that Iowa didn't try to get him the ball. There were problems with drops this year at times. But as the season progressed, you saw him. I think that certainly the tweet didn't help. I mean, that's not going to help your cause for playing time, and I think Tyrone knows that. But again, there were times where Iowa tried to get him the ball, and Tyrone didn't make the most of it, especially early in the season. There were no games this year where Tyrone really jumped off the screen, jumped off the stat sheet, and that's unfortunate. Obviously, teams were honed in on him early, but as the season went on, he's just kind of regressed, unfortunately, and it's too bad because, again, good kid. He's a hard worker, and we'll see where he ends up. I mean, the transfer portal, you always have the opportunity to return, but he's not coming back. I mean, I think we can all acknowledge that. So what does this mean for Iowa at wide receiver moving forward? That is an interesting question, and I saw Tom Kakert, our good friend Tom Kakert over at HawkeyeReport.com, tweet about this earlier. Iowa's now down to 6 scholarship wide receivers. Again, assuming Desmond Hudson and Tyrone Tracy both leave because they both entered the portal. So now you're down to Deontay Vines, the redshirt freshman out of Connecticut. Of course, Keegan Johnson from Bellevue, Arlen Bruce from Kansas, Brody Breck, the kid from Ankeny, who is a dual sport athlete, and then, of course, Nico Reganey. So, does Charlie Jones return? That's a question. I kind of felt like he probably would. That's just a gut feeling. I wouldn't be surprised if he left, but I think he'll be a big part of this offense if he comes back. Certainly, he'll have his role back as punt and kick returner. And I think Iowa could use his services at wide receiver. The one thing that shouldn't be understated, I don't want to put this all on Tyrone Tracy. It's not Tyrone Tracy. I mean, I feel bad for him because he's been jumped by some receivers who have really emerged in Johnson and Bruce. But let's also remember that Iowa's play calling this year has not been the best. I think I would hope that Brian Ferentz could admit that, and Kirk Ferentz could admit that it's not always been very good. And then you have also struggles at quarterback and struggles with pass protection, which doesn't help your receivers, especially a guy like Tyrone, who, he's not a guy who's necessarily as explosive off the line of scrimmage like a Keegan Johnson or even an Arlen Bruce. So, I feel bad for him all around. And I don't blame a kid like Tracy or Hudson leaving just because of the fact that this offense is one of the worst offenses in the Big Ten. You could make the argument it's maybe the worst, possibly ahead of Indiana, but who's really counting the Hoosiers right now? And so wide receiver really isn't a position where Iowa is going to be able to retain players who aren't getting a lot of playing time. I mean, it's just why stay? I understand. I understand why you leave. I understand why you leave, especially if you're not in the field playing regularly. So, again, going back to Iowa's wide receivers and their wide receiver room, Max Cooper is a senior. Disappointed for Max. He's a scholarship kid who came back for an extra year after struggling with some injury, and he really hasn't seen the field. He had a punt return earlier in the year where he muffed it, and I'm saddened for Max Cooper, another really good kid, and it just hasn't worked out. And I don't think he can come back. If I recall, I'd have to look at his his profile here. Again, he redshirted because of injury. Yeah, so he was out last year because of injury, so he's not going to get an extra year because he took the red shirt during the COVID year. I believe that's it for Max Cooper, unfortunately. And again, I think you're looking at Charlie Jones being one of Iowa's biggest recruits here in the coming weeks. Can you get him to stay? I wouldn't be shocked if Nico Reganey transferred. I mean, I don't know. I have no inside information on that. I just wouldn't be shocked. I mean, we've seen his role kind of lessened here, and we've also seen him struggle with some drops. Again, it's not just about individual performances. It's also about, do we have a quarterback that can consistently get you the ball when you do get open? Do we have a quarterback that sees you when you're open? And let's be honest, that doesn't always happen here. And then, again, the struggles with play calling have just compounded the issues there. So, again, Deontay Vines, Keegan Johnson, Arlen Bruce, Brody Brecht, Nico Reganey. Don't forget Jackson Ritter played some early. He's a walk-on from Illinois. He played some early in the season. I wouldn't be shocked to see him, if Iowa doesn't get a transfer or, of course, Jacob Bostic's a kid that we'll talk about in a moment. I would be shocked to see Jackson Ritter get more playing time next year. Again, he kind of disappeared. He seemed to be a reliable pass catcher early on this season. And I'm talking the first few games against pretty good competition in Indiana and Iowa State. Again, I know Indiana is not what we made them out to be initially, but again, Big Ten competition. So we'll see. Wide receiver room's a little thin, as is the tight end room after we had Josiah Miamin leave. Jacob Bostic's a kid who's coming in next year. We haven't really talked a whole lot about him. 3-star kid according to most recruiting rankings. 6'2". He's going to have to, he's listed according to Rivals at 165, so he's going to have to bulk up a bit to play in the Big Ten. There's no question about it. Very thin, 6'2", and he committed this past summer. He did have some good offers. If you're just looking at an offer list, Cincinnati was invested in Jacob. Brett Bielema at Illinois recruited him hard once Brett took the job there. And then, of course, Kansas State, Pittsburgh. Those are the other two Power 5 offers. I shouldn't say the only two. I mean, the AAC is not really part of the Power 5. I get that there. I guess you want to call it Power 6. They did recruit him and offer him as well. And then, of course, a number of non-Power 5, Group of 5 offers for Jacob. So, we'll see. I mean, you never know with these kids who's going to come here and change positions. Obviously, at 6'2", I don't see Jacob transitioning to defensive back. We've seen that at times at Iowa, wide receivers switching over. Although 6'2", you could certainly do that if the need was there. But I think right now the need is at wide receiver, so I'd be shocked if Iowa did that at least this coming year. I don't know if he's got any plans to enroll early. Not heard his plans. But certainly Bostic's a kid that if you're Iowa, you want to make sure that he's fully invested because, again, that wide receiver room is thin. And as far as guys who Iowa has on its radar, I really can't tell you. Of course, they've got Cale Vanderbush, who's a tight end. He's not going to be switching to wide receiver. There's really nobody else on the roster or on the recruiting commit list that I really see, transitioning once they get here to wide receiver. So, can you go with 7 scholarship wide receivers? I don't know why you couldn't, especially if Jackson Ritter's a factor. But again, we'll see. Nico Reganey, I have no insider information on that, but I would not be shocked to see him move on. He's from Connecticut. He's not playing as much as he did early. Certainly not getting targeted quite as much as he did early on in his career, just like Tyrone Tracy has not been. So we will see what we shall see. And, of course, tomorrow, big announcement, Iowa recruiting related, the announcement from Xavier Wampa, and we'll be reacting to that live following his announcement right here from the Hawkeye of the Storm on YouTube. So appreciate you checking in here this afternoon. Again, the news today, Tyrone Tracy, Iowa wide receiver, junior wide receiver, 5'11", 201, listed according to the University of Iowa from Indianapolis, has decided to transfer, has entered his name into the transfer portal. We shall see where he ends up. And Iowa now, with another wide receiver gone, that's 2 now. Desmond Hudson announced his intentions to transfer earlier this season, and now Tyrone Tracy on his way out again as well. Thank you for joining us again. We'll be back tomorrow to react to the Xavier Wampa news right here from the Hawkeye of the Storm. We'll talk to you soon.